I'm guessing some of you heard my talk. That's nice. I'm surprised you came here then. The reality of life is I want you to appreciate how arrogant I am. Because I don't think most people think through arrogance. So, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, there's very little that I think or know or say that both wasn't true and that I didn't actually know a long time ago. I just keep saying it in slightly different ways over and over and over again. And one of the things that's core to everything about capital markets is, which is nearly impossible for humans to fully accept in their bones, is that markets are pre-pricers of all widely known information. And the basis for making a trade away from a designated benchmark that's appropriate for you, in theory, is that you believe somehow, some way, that you know something that other people don't know. I just want you to think about what an arrogant statement that is. So I make active bets, and many of you may make active bets, and I just want you to appreciate the arrogance of that. Because once you appreciate that as arrogant, it steps you back a little bit and makes you say, am I really right, or am I just being arrogant? And half the time, I don't even know which I am, which is scarier still. So let me just give you some really simple examples of that. You take the current president, or the last president, or the president before that, because we almost always have one. No, it's true. I've studied it in history. And people have strong opinions about these people. Some people like them, some people don't like them. It's likely that a lot of the people that have feelings one way or another about the current president had very different feelings about the prior president, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know. So somebody will say, well, this is because of the president. And my first question to them, which they never like, is, what do you know about the president other people don't know? Because fundamentally, I've never known anything about any of these presidents. I knew a little bit about one of them after he was no longer president. But I've never known anything about any of these presidents while they were president that other people didn't know. You follow that? So to try to make an investment decision based on your perceptions about the president is something which inherently, by capital markets theory and by my observation in reality, is pre-priced. And then the other part, which is standard behavioralism, is that we're all suffering confirmation bias. And I'm guessing you know what confirmation bias is, but it's the propensity to see things that confirm your prior biases and not see things that dispute or contradict your prior biases. And so in that, you know, I think this about the president, whoever the president is at the time, and it works out that way, and you think, boy, gee, see, I was smart and I knew what I was doing. And then when the reverse happens and it doesn't work out, you blame it on something else, because what confirmation bias says is that we have this huge human propensity to do what's called in behavioralism shunning regret, accumulating pride and shunning regret. You know, I bought it, it went up, I'm smart. I bought it and it went down. My wife shouldn't have been bugging me that day, right? Stuff like that, right? The broker sold it to me. The dog ate the homework, all that stuff. So what I'm wanting you to see is that my basic view is that I do believe in taking bets. I don't believe in taking that many bets. And I believe you got to think you know something other people don't focus on or would process completely wrong. And if we ever get a power chord that works here, then I'm going to show you some stuff, but I want to just babble at you about one of the things that I think is one of the most fundamental misunderstandings of the last decade. People believe, and you've read this endlessly, that we only had an expansion because the central banks of the world flooded the system with money. You've read that over and over again? So when I was young, you know, I was a student at Chicago School, and I was trained to follow the money in a very simple Friedman-like sense. What's happening with the quantity of money? And I can show you this if we ever get a power cord, but the actual growth, annualized in the quantity of money, has been the slowest in this economic expansion by a lot of any expansion in any of your lifetimes. And therefore, it is not possible that the expansion is because we flooded the system with money, because where's the money? Do you follow that? And instead, they say this over and over again because people confuse what quantitative easing is with what quantitative easing does. I just want to talk to you for a second about what quantitative easing does. So here come the troops. Here comes the rescue squad. Boy, oh boy, we got every cord under the sun here. Do you know
Yes.
which cords are which?
Yes.
For a kid from the 1950s, all these cords get a little beyond me, right? So, anyway, think about for a second what quantitative easing does. It buys long-term debt securities paid for with Federal Reserve credit, right? Think what that means, what that implies. That implies that it's pushing up the price of treasuries as they're bought, which lowers the yield, right? Relative to what the yield would be otherwise. So think about that for a second. If I push up the price of treasuries relative to what they would be otherwise, dropping the yield relative to what they would be otherwise, is that prone to increase the quantity of money more or not?
Do you want to use the microphone?
Oh, you want me to use the mic? Most people are happier if I just talk them to sleep. So, think about it this way, because most people don't. What's the core business of banking? The core business of banking for eons and eons and eons has been taking in short-term deposits as the basis for making long-term loans. And the spread between short-term rates and long-term rates, aka the yield curve, is a reflection of the marginal propensity of the banking system to lend. Because the steeper the spread, the more gross operating profit margin the bank makes on the next subsequent loan it makes. You follow the simplicity of that? And when the spread is smaller, there's a smaller future gross operating profit margin on the loans that a bank makes. When it's bigger, more so. So if you push down long rates, do you get more or less bank lending? You get less bank lending. When you get less bank lending, does the quantity of money grow faster or slower? Remember how we grow the quantity of money in any fractional reserve banking system. We do that directly by increasing net outstanding bank loans. So if we decrease loan growth, we decrease the quantity of money growth. If you decrease the quantity of money growth, you don't flood the system with money. Once you actually understand that stuff in a very simple sense, you would know intuitively from the beginning that the expansion was despite quantitative easing, not because of it. Once you get that, it opens up your brain to a whole different concept of thought. Because if everybody thinks we're having the expansion only because of flooding the system with money when we're not flooding the system with money, which I'll show you in a minute. Thank you so very much. You are so very...
I didn't fix it. I'm going to get someone.
No, I can... Oh, you don't have it working?
No.
Oh. That was blue. That was blue.
Give me 2 minutes.
Beyond colors, I don't know much. So once you actually get that we grew the quantity of money slower in this economic expansion than any of your lifetimes, which you would expect when you put in a place of quantitative easing, because every place quantitative easing has ever been deployed, you get relative deflation. Think of Europe in recent years, where they've used quantitative easing in the way they have, as they fear deflation, but they get low money growth. So what I'm talking to you about is knowing something other people don't know. What I want you to see is how arrogant that is on the one hand, how it's not easy to do, And the third part is that it's not easy to just kind of make flippant decisions that the market should do well because of this president or badly because of that president, or I don't like the tax bill, or I do like the tax bill. Let's talk tax bills for a second. You all saw we had a tax bill? Yeah, no, I read about it in the newspaper. I don't know where you heard about it, but I read about it in the newspaper. Do you think that stuff gets pre-priced? We actually have a long history. This is a really simple lesson. We have a long history of tax changes. Did you know that? Sometimes raising them, sometimes lowering them, this kind, that kind, the other kind, right? You can tally them all up. You can say all the capital gains cuts, all the income tax cuts, all the corporate rate tax cuts, all of this, all of that, and you can say, literally, we got this long history. What happened in the next 12 months? What happened in the next 36 months? And you can see if there's a lot of juice there, counter to what you believe, because one of those three questions that I talked to you about when I was babbling before from my one book was, what do you believe that's actually false? And the reality is markets should pre-price all tax bills, right? Because they're all debated in public for a long time. Before they're implemented, everybody sees them coming. The market should pre-price them. In fact, the market does pre-price them because there's actually no material variance on any consistent basis after any hikes, cuts of income, capital gains, or corporate. I find that to be normal but fascinating, that people don't pick up on stuff like that. I also find it fascinating that I can't make a computer work. So with that, since I don't have visuals here for right now, maybe I'll just open things up to questions for a while because we can keep on track until I get visuals. And maybe the part that I would do with visuals, I'll do toward the end of the time, if we ever get the computer to work. And if we don't, we'll just do questions. Do any of you have any questions?
What do you feel is the action to be taken concerning the debt and the interest rates rising? Is there going to be something happening soon? Paying more interest on the debt?
So let's think about that for a second. Do we have a lot of inflation? No. What is a long rate? A long rate's, as you may have learned it in school, it's a real rate plus an inflation premium. The real rate doesn't vary very much. You get the real rate to go through the roof in a crisis. Shy of a crisis, the real rate doesn't move much. The nominal rate is the real rate plus the inflation premium. So if we're not in a crisis, it's hard to get long rates up much without a big pickup in inflation. How do you get a big pickup in inflation? You grow the quantity of money, because inflation is the aftermath of too much money chasing too few goods. Simple concept. It's not anything else. It's, as Milton Friedman always said, it's always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And therefore, if you don't have the quantity of money growing at a high rate, you don't get future inflation picking up. If you don't get future inflation picking up, you don't get the inflation premium picking up. If you're not in a crisis, it's hard to get long rates up very much. And then I'm going to tell you another little secret. The way markets work, not only do the markets pre-price everything you and I think, but they pre-price everything everybody else thinks, right? Which includes professionals. And one of the tricks that I learned a long, long time ago is that professional forecasters are wronger, stronger, and longer than normal people because their biases are stronger. They're trained to the biases and they hold on to them longer. So since they do, if you can figure out what professionals agree will occur, doesn't tell you what will occur, but tells you what's been pre-priced and something else will occur. Do you follow the simplicity of that? If you can construct professionals' forecasts into a kind of a Gaussian bell curve distribution, the middle of that bell curve almost never happens because that's what's been pre-priced. And professional forecasters overwhelmingly view that rates will rise by a fair amount. Therefore, the likelihood of that is very low because it's been pre-priced. Note all of the excitement this year over a 20 beep rate rise in the long rate. Now, I think your question may have been more fundamentally about debt problems to begin with. We don't have any debt problems. Let me just take you through that. People get this wrong all the time. Think about it this way. Right now, people say things like, "Oh my gosh, we got almost $20 trillion of government debt. Isn't that terrible?" You've heard stuff like that? Well, first off, that's not really very important, because what's really important is the amount of debt that the government has issued that it itself doesn't own, and the U.S. government has always been the largest owner of U.S. debt because it uses it like its savings accounts. It's all short-term debt that it uses like its own piggy bank for its agencies. So the debt you're supposed to worry about, if you're to worry about debt, is what's called net public debt, the amount of debt the government has issued that it itself does not own, because that's the only thing that forces it to pay net interest payments. Does that make sense to you? And that amount is 15 trillion. Then you then say, what's it cost them to service a debt? So if you actually look at the total service costs on U.S. government debt, they're currently 7.9% of U.S. tax revenue, which may seem like a lot to you, but for every year from 1986 until 1998, they were over 16%. If you remember that world, it was a world of less debt relative to the size of the economy, but it's only this much less, because what's really not important is the total amount of debt. It's the total amount of debt relative to the size of the economy, relative to the interest burden associated with it. And we used to have twice the carrying costs relative to government that we have today. Would that be reversed if you had a big pickup in interest rates? Absolutely. But remember, it's got to be a big pickup in interest rates that sustains for a long time, because if we raise rates hugely tomorrow, it impacts almost nothing at all. It only impacts the amount of debt that's short term. The long-term debt's still sitting there at the prior rates. So if you look at the last month, the government was rolling over 3.5% and 4.5% debt into sub 3% debt, right? We're still in a process of more or less going sideways in terms of the service costs relative to tax revenue. Let me babble at you a different way. So what you need to do is you need to get rates to rise long enough, high enough to make carrying costs as a percentage of tax revenue a theoretical burden that scares people away from U.S. debt. I want you to think through another point which you may have observed or may not have observed. Every time there's a crisis, what happens to the price of U.S. government debt relative to other countries' debt? Every single time it goes up. Every single time it goes up. Which tells you that the fears of foreign debt, whether it's British, Japanese, German, you name it, rise more in a panic than they rise here. Even though it's panic, they rise everywhere at the same time because everything's global, right? They're coordinated. But why? Because we don't have a debt problem. So let me take this to you a different way. And I don't have this with me. I might have it with me. If I have it with me, it's a couple of years old, because I got a lot of Q&A things in here if I can ever get it working. You can use Federal Reserve data to build a complete balance sheet of America, public and private sector. So I just want you to think this through. In a world where GDP is basically about 20 trillion, and in a world where total assets, forget about liabilities, assets in America, public and private sector all added up, are about 177 trillion, we actually have a fairly high return on assets in terms of income relative to assets. As long as that is very high compared to borrowing costs, what you should want above and beyond other things in that environment is for smart borrowers to borrow the money and spend it on something productive. You follow that? Because if the smart borrowers borrow and spend it on something productive, it'll increase the income relative to the size of the assets. You want them to borrow more, buy more assets that are smart assets that generate a high return, which distributes income throughout the society, right? You don't like it if it's a dumb borrower, right? You like it if it's a smart borrower. You get that notion that if Microsoft decides it wants to borrow money to put in a plant, that you don't think that's probably a stupid idea. You think they probably have some sense of what they're doing, and that's the competitive place in the marketplace, and you don't fundamentally disagree with that, right? Maybe not if Uncle Sam decides they want to do something with the money, right? But if Microsoft or Amazon or private sector wants to, you're thinking that's all good, right? If that's for me, I'm busy. So, at least for a little while. I wouldn't say anything better to them than I say to you. So let me just babble at you for a second more on this. Here's the part that people don't get. When we create money, and I learned this when I was a kid, we create money by the banking system increasing its net outstanding loans. That's the way we increase money in our society. It's always been throughout the entire developed world. Does the person that borrows that money spend it faster or slower than the average spend in our society? They spend it faster because they're not going to take out the loan until they're ready to spend it, right? So they spend it almost immediately on whatever they're going to spend it on. And that increases the so-called velocity of money. But that money after the first spend in America on average gets spent 6 times in the first 12 months. So when money is created, what matters is not the intelligence, if you will, of the first spend, but the average of the 6. And if the first spend is a stupid spender, like maybe the government, maybe? Some of you don't have 100% confidence in the government's ultimate ability to generate a high return on what it spends its money on. And I don't want to get into that argument because I don't do culture because I got a lot of class and all of it's low. The fact is, if you think about it, anything they spend their money on, except for foreign aid, goes to a person or a business. And that person or the business on average is average and spends it averagely, consistent with the average of the 6. So it's better if the first spender is a smart spender because that brings up the average above the average of the 6. But even if it's a stupid spender, it doesn't matter that much. It matters some. It's negative. It's not as good. But it's the average of the 6 that matters. And that concept, which is fundamentally valid, is also fundamentally confusing to people. And in a world where we're not over-indebted when people think we are, because we have a high return on assets, we have low borrowing costs relative to that, we have low carrying costs of the debt compared to our known ability to handle it because we've been there, done that. Did you think the 80s and 90s were pretty good? I wish I had the body I had in the 80s and 90s, right? I thought the 80s and 90s were pretty good. I think today's pretty good, actually. But we suffered carrying burdens of the debt relative to the size of the government revenues, or for that matter, the size of the U.S. economy, 2x what we have today, for a long time. If we could do that then, we could do it now with our eyes closed. And so, no, I don't think that's any kind of an issue. I don't think it's going to be an issue anytime soon. Might it be an issue eventually? Yes. But what you want to do is keep your eye on that issue of the carrying costs relative to the tax revenue and what percentage it is. And if it starts getting up above 15%, maybe we're going to go in, if it keeps going, into new uncharted territory. But I'm going to give you one more kind of thing that I believe to be a secret that people don't get. Markets don't give a rat's darn about anything more than about 30 months into the future. If you fundamentally said, I know that in the year 2030 this is going to happen, whether it's good or bad wouldn't make a difference, markets just fundamentally aren't going to believe it. So you can just write off in the short term, not necessarily the long term, huge categories of things where people get all excited about the long-term future. You know, I wrote a USA Today column not very long ago, a couple months ago, on all of the dismal long-term forecasts we've had in history that ended up being wrong, often associated with issues of science. You know, and I don't want to go to things like climate change and stuff like that because I don't want to get into any of that kind of stuff. But there's often been this part where people say, well, you know, a classic example is Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb that a lot of you remember. and all those kind of things, and you're going to have this classic problem, and it's going to be this and it's going to be that. Markets don't care. They don't pay attention to that stuff because it's too far out in the future. They only care when you get to approximately about 30 months into the future. Markets don't discount the very long term. And so this feature that you fear, and I understand why people fear it, because basically, as I said in my talk earlier, people believe, debt's bad, more debt's worse, too much debt, you go to hell. You got to get a debt problem that's about 30 months out before it really impacts markets in a way other than normal volatility. Yeah, sir.
How do you discern an ongoing bull market from an early bear?
Yeah, so I wish I had visuals, and maybe we will. Looks like the troops are coming again. A big bag with probably more stuff or more of this
I
or.
want to make sure that was in it.
So I'm going to keep trying to talk to you here. So, do you remember the line that? Feel free. You remember the line that I used in the presentation with the little visual that was John Templeton's that said, "Bull markets are born on pessimism, grow on skepticism, mature on optimism, and die of euphoria." So my version of that of bear markets is that bear markets are born on euphoria, that they grow on grinding economics, they accelerate on recession, and they die on panic. If you think of that as a four-phase model with recessions and bear markets shorter usually than economic expansion bull markets, that pattern of born on euphoria is because when the market hits a peak and starts to go down initially, look at that, we're getting light, we're getting action. Now if we can get pictures, you will have been, look at that. Look at that, look at that, look at that. Ready for a password and everything. Yay! You are the you're the master. Would you like to come up and just give the talk?
Not today.
No,
Do you
no,
have
they
any audio on there?
No.
Should be good to go then.
Thank you so very much.
Do you always get euphoria before the bull market ends, or what?
No, the question was, do we always get euphoria before the bull market ends? You remember in the talk that I gave in the other room, what I said is that the Templeton Mantra of bull markets are born on pessimism, grow on skepticism, mature on optimism, and die on euphoria is always true except when it isn't. And when it isn't is when there's that thing that's big enough to cause global recession that nobody's seen, which in an $80 trillion plus global economy requires something on the high side of a couple of $1 trillion of negatives that people haven't pre-priced, which happens sometimes, but it's rare and it's hard to see. Usually bull markets end with euphoria.
So it's kind of like a black swan event like happened back in 2008, I guess it was, which was unanticipated, or?
Yeah, so the question is more or less what caused 2008, which was a wallop. And, there are people have talked about this. I didn't understand it correctly at the time. Almost no one did. Still today, I think most people don't understand it. But the reality of that is that that I don't think most people got is all of that was caused by FAS 157 and ISB 157, which was the alleged infamous mark-to-market accounting, which wiped $2 trillion off of bank balance sheets in 12 months. And if you wipe $2 trillion that no one's anticipating between its implementation in 2007 and October of 2008, it had wiped $2 trillion off of bank balance sheets with no subsequent parallel transactions. If you take $2 trillion off the global bank balance sheets, you will get them to contract loans hugely. If you get them to contract loans hugely, you will get recession. You follow? And the bottom of the market, quite literally, was within about, don't hold me to this, 5 weeks of the elimination of the implementation of FAS 157 and ISB 157. because it ended that process of the downward musical chairs of banks writing off assets when there were no parallel transactions. If you want, I can take you through that in more detail, but I'm still trying to figure out right now how to get out of this, and I do know how to do it, and get back into what I want to get into. So the reality when you don't have a wallop, and wallops are not common, is you get euphoria. And bear markets normally, even when you have a wallop, have big, broad rolling tops. Now, that isn't what I want. I'm going to do this a different way. The normal process of a bull market peak that people don't appreciate is a big, broad rolling top. Bull markets don't spike top. People always fear the spike top, and you can understand why. If I don't get out soon enough, I'm in deep trouble. There has never been a major bear market on a global basis that spiked top. If you take, for example, 1929, and you look at the global markets, it was a big broad roll. America spike topped, but if you were looking overseas first, you would have seen it. That's the reason you always wanted to think global first, local second. The fact of the matter is, boy, oh boy, I can't get this thing to act right no matter what I do. The fact of the matter is that that big broad roll leads me to what I call my 3% rule. I mean, my 3-month rule. And my 3-month rule says you never, which actually applies right now, you never try to call a bear market until 3 months after you've seen previously higher prices, because the first relative months of a bear market are always relatively gentle. And the amount that you lose in the first 3 months of a real global bear market is a single-digit percentage, just like now. Now, I'm not saying we have a bear market, that's not where I'm going. My point is you never try to call it in advance of the peak, because people that have, the markets are just littered with people that got out of stocks way too early, as the bull market would just keep going. If you just take this bull market, you could see that over and over and over again, which is the pessimism of disbelief. And so my point to you is that, simply said, the first rule is wait until 3 months after you've seen a peak, because the initial decline of a real bear market is gentle. Why is it gentle? The market's prime goal is to humiliate as many people as possible for as many dollars as possible for as long as possible. And if it gives you a blast signal that scares everybody in moment one, it can't do that. You follow the simplicity of this? It has to have that broad, gentle roll so that as the bear market begins, people who hadn't gotten in earlier can see this as the break they can buy into. Do you follow the simplicity of that? All throughout the course of a bull market's evolution, as it's going up, you started with the owners being people who were the least afraid of owning equity in what was otherwise a scary time. And as the bull market progressed, people get over their fear, and they get over their fear, and they get over their fear. And the last greater fools to get in don't get in at the peak. They get in after the peak. But if you had an announcement effect, a sharp spike top, they wouldn't be able to do that. They'd freak out right there. Instead, it's got to be relatively gentle early on. You take the correction, if you want to call it that began in late January. I mean, that didn't even get to 10% on a global basis, right? And in that, it's not one of the more extreme corrections in the world. Bull markets are full of corrections that are stronger and more pervasive and than that. So it likes that gentle beginning. The other point is that 2/3 of the actual decline in a bear market happen in the last 1/3 of its time. That's almost uniform. Not perfectly uniform, but it's almost uniform. It is uniform that most of the drop happens in the back third of the time. It's that panic part that gets you, right? The beginning part begins on euphoria, grows on grinding economics. That's where, I mean, markets are leading indicators, right? Market peaks before the economy peaks. Market troughs before the economy troughs. The consistency, that's real strong. That part of the grinding economics, recessions don't start fast. Recessions start slow. So there's this long first 2/3 of the bear market where it grinds on you before you get to that panic part. So what you're really looking for once you're 3 months past the peak is, do I have a laundry list of standard things that have been associated with causing bear markets in the past? Or can I see some new big bad thing that totals a lot of money that isn't widely pre-priced? So what are some of the things that you know traditionally have been causal to bear markets? Well, one of them that you know about is the inverted yield curve, right? Now, you remember I talked before, why does the inverted yield curve matter? It matters because when short rates are above long rates, taking in deposits from a borrower of comparable quality to a lender that you lend to, if that lender is the same quality as that lender, if this borrower who's lending you, the bank, the money, is of a given quality, and this borrower is of a comparable quality, and this spread is negative, you're losing money on the loan. You're not going to do it. Once you move the yield curve to be inverted, the only way the bank can make money on a loan is to borrow from this guy and lend to a riskier customer that's got to pay a higher interest rate. And once they're making risky loans, you're in trouble anyway. So now we're going to try this from the beginning again. Now that we've had time to purge the memory. There we go. Now we're doing the right thing, I think. So anyway, that's and the last part, of course, is just panic. And the panic's still going on while you get to the beginning. Yeah, Steve.
You referred to this as the Goldilocks period. What are the fundamentals that convince you that's so?
Well, I kind of rattled the question was, I've referred to this in my talk before, as kind of a Goldilocks period. What are some of the features that make me believe that so? You remember the concept of Goldilocks, which is not too hot, not too cold, just right? We're talking about the porridge and all that stuff, right? So if you think about the economy on a global basis, it is kind of a porridge, right? And if you look at the world's economy, it's growing, but not too much as to be scary. If you look at unemployment globally, it's good, but not good enough globally. I mean, it's 8+% in Europe, right? Not good enough globally to be scary. Inflation is good. The stock market is good. The volatility is higher, but it's not bad. What are the bad parts? Let's see. I don't like the president. I didn't say I don't like the president. I don't do politics, right? Oops. Oh boy. So basically, when you think about it, what's too hot or too cold? What's too much or too little? Everything's pretty moderate. Pardon me? No, we just covered the debt. The debt's not bad at all. I mean, we just had a long discussion about the debt. Our society, I'm just going to say this to you really simply. Our society is under indebted. We're not over indebted. The spread, those spreads that I was talking about are so huge. If the stupidest borrower in the world that does nothing but buys $500 hammers loads up on them, we're better off. We are not over indebted in our society. We're under indebted. If you think of debt like a financial tool, our society benefits even when stupid borrowers borrow more right now. The comparative cost of money leads you to that conclusion almost overwhelmingly. People have talked about us having too much debt for how long? And when does it come home to roost? It only comes home to roost when the comparative cost of money makes it problematic.
Well, what about the government debt?
I just covered the government debt. I spent eons talking about the government debt and the carrying costs. And I gave you numbers.
Said it doesn't make any difference because we're at
No, I said that the carrying costs of the debt are low compared to many times in our past. Therefore, they are not problematic. Our debt carrying costs are very low. People don't want to believe that because people have the bias, as I've said over and over again, debt's bad, more debt's worse, too much debt, you go to hell, therefore we're about to go to hell. Where's the triggering mechanism?
And you said, there was a panel yesterday that talked about what indicators they were nervous about. For the most part, they were saying many of the indicators around unemployment, number of other things, not the debt, were at historical levels that eventually led to stock market drops in 6 to 12 months. And just curious, I don't remember exactly which ones they were, but that was their view in the panel. Just curious if there's other indicators out there that are leading towards that potential concern.
So I just think that's all horseshit. Let me just make this real clear. Let me just make this real clear. That they were all saying that, which you can also read in the newspapers very widely, tells you it's pre-priced. You follow that?
Yes.
This is, again, I go back to the question. What do you know other people don't know? They're all mimicking the same nonsense that by definition, since they're saying it, must be pre-priced. The fact of the matter is, let's see, they're saying that things would be better if we had higher unemployment. I think that by itself is really hard to prove one way or the other. They say, for example, you've heard endless talk about the slope of the yield curve, right? Again, if you didn't hear talk about the yield curve, it would be more telling. You follow me? But I'm going to make a different point to you that I make over and over and over again, which is that fundamentally what matters, this is really, really hard for people to want to accept, is not the U.S. yield curve. The U.S. economy is 23% of global GDP. What matters is the global yield curve. Oh, I've only got 2 more minutes? My God, and I just got to the visuals. Look at that. How about that? So let me take 2 minutes to rattle through this. Normally, bull markets accelerate in the last third, and we haven't had much acceleration yet. Secondarily, there's the rollover. You see the rollover where they die with a whimper, not with a bang, the big broad roll at the top? Doesn't matter which one you pick. They're all pretty much that way, big broad roll. A lot of time up in here. I mean, a long time up in here. Gentle in the beginning, steep in the back. It's the back part that kills you. This is that 1929 thing I was talking about. There's 1929, which people confuse because they didn't think globally. If you look at the European markets, there's the big broad roll. You follow? If you think of the U.S. market, you will have sectors in the market that drop before other sectors in the market. You know that, right? But you're looking at the whole market. You want to look at the global market. I think I have 60 seconds left, and so there's my euphoria grinding thing. So my first rule is the other part is from peak to trough. Bear markets average about 2%, 2 to 3% a month from peak to trough. And as they start off more gently and they accelerate. That gets you to your 3-month rule, my 2/3 rule, and then my final rule is never stay. If you've got a reason to own equity, never stay out of the market longer than 18 months because there's precious few bear markets that are longer than 18 months. And if you couldn't do it accurately enough to get it in 18 months, you're not doing it accurately enough to keep betting on staying out. So with that, I've said a whole lot. I wish I could go through all the other visuals that I had with you, but what was it Gene Simmons said? Life's what happens when you're planning otherwise, or something like that. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate your time. I guess we're out of time, and so I'll see you another time.
What is the corporate buyback do thing?